Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My name is Kieran, and 3 years ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was 30 years old, worth $8.7 million, and married to the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I owned a penthouse in downtown Chicago, drove a Lamborghini Huracan, and could make more money in a single trading session than most people earn in a year. I was living the dream that every young man fantasizes about when he first discovers the stock market, and I genuinely believed that my success was the result of intelligence, discipline, and an almost supernatural ability to read market patterns. I was wrong about everything, but it took losing almost everything to understand just how wrong I'd been. The woman I loved more than life itself had been systematically destroying me from the inside, using my own success as a weapon against me. And by the time I discovered what Isadora was doing, she had created a financial disaster so complex and devastating that it would take me 2 years to fully understand the scope of her betrayal. This is the story of how I went from millionaire trader to financial ruin, not because of market crashes or bad investments, but because the person I trusted most in the world had been playing a different game entirely, one where my success was just the raw material she needed to build her own empire of lies and debt. I met Isadora 5 years ago at a charity gala in Manhattan, one of those black tie affairs where wealthy people gather to feel good about themselves while networking and showing off their latest acquisitions. I had just closed a particularly profitable quarter trading tech stocks and was feeling invincible in the way that only comes from watching your net worth increase by 7 figures in 3 months. She was standing near the bar, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, talking to a group of older men who were hanging on her every word like she was dispensing the secrets of the universe. Isadora had this quality that I've never seen in anyone else, a combination of intelligence and beauty and confidence that made everyone around her feel like they were in the presence of something rare and valuable. When she looked at me across that crowded ballroom, I felt like I'd been chosen for something special, like all my trading success had been leading to this moment when I would meet the woman who would complete my perfect life. We talked for 3 hours that night, and I learned that she worked in luxury real estate, specializing in properties for high net worth individuals, which explained her presence at an event where the average net worth was probably $50 million. She understood money in a way that most people didn't, understood the psychology of wealth and the subtle dynamics of how rich people interacted with each other and with the world. When I told her about my trading career, she didn't react with the usual mixture of awe and skepticism that I'd grown accustomed to from women who didn't understand financial markets. Instead, she asked intelligent questions about my strategies, my risk management, my long-term goals, and I found myself opening up to her in ways that I'd never done with anyone else. By the end of the evening, I was completely infatuated, and when she agreed to dinner the following week, I felt like I'd won some kind of cosmic lottery that had nothing to do with stock picks or market timing. Our courtship was like something out of a movie about wealthy young people living glamorous lives in expensive cities. We went to Michelin-starred restaurants where the wine cost more than most people's monthly rent, took weekend trips to Paris and London and Tokyo, stayed in penthouse suites at hotels where celebrities and billionaires conducted their private business away from the prying eyes of the public. Isadora had expensive tastes, but I didn't mind because I could afford them, and her enthusiasm for the finer things in life seemed to validate my own success. She would research the best restaurants in whatever city we were visiting, book us into the most exclusive hotels, arrange for private tours of art galleries and museums. And I began to see these experiences not as frivolous spending, but as investments in a lifestyle that reflected my achievements as a trader. When she moved into my penthouse after 6 months of dating, it felt like the natural progression of a relationship between two people who understood that money was just a tool for creating the kind of life that most people could only dream about. The wedding was everything Isadora had ever wanted, a $300,000 affair at an estate in the Hamptons with flowers flown in from Holland and a guest list that read like a directory of New York's financial elite. I paid for everything without question because I was making more money than I could spend, and seeing Isadora happy made me feel like I was finally living up to the potential that my trading success had revealed. She quit her job in real estate after we got married, saying that she wanted to focus on being a wife and managing our household, which seemed reasonable given that my income was sufficient to support any lifestyle she might want to create. I was traveling frequently for business, attending trading conferences and meeting with institutional clients, and it was comforting to know that she was handling all the domestic details that I didn't have time for. Isadora took over managing our household finances, paying bills, coordinating with our accountant and financial advisor, handling insurance policies and investment accounts, and I was grateful to have someone I could trust with these responsibilities. She seemed to have a natural talent for financial management, understanding complex investment products and tax strategies in ways that impressed even our professional advisors. When she suggested that we diversify our assets by opening additional investment accounts and credit lines, I agreed without really examining the details because I trusted her judgment and because I was too focused on my trading activities to pay attention to what seemed like routine financial housekeeping. The first year of our marriage was probably the happiest period of my life. My trading profits continued to grow, reaching new heights as I developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for timing market movements and identifying undervalued opportunities. Isadora seemed to thrive in her role as the wife of a successful trader, attending social events with other wealthy couples, decorating our penthouse with expensive art and furniture, planning elaborate vacations to exotic locations where we could enjoy the fruits of my labor. She would often surprise me with expensive gifts, watches, and jewelry and gadgets that she claimed to have bought with money from her own investment portfolio, which she said was performing well under the guidance of a private wealth manager she'd connected with through her former real estate contacts. I never questioned these purchases because they seemed consistent with our overall lifestyle, and because Isadora had always been financially sophisticated in ways that made me trust her judgment about money matters. Looking back, I can see that there were warning signs that I should have recognized, small inconsistencies and irregularities that might have alerted me to what was really happening if I hadn't been so focused on my own success and so confident in my ability to generate unlimited wealth through trading. Isadora would sometimes be vague about the details of her investment activities, claiming that her wealth manager preferred to keep his strategies confidential to protect his competitive advantages. She would receive phone calls at odd hours that she would take in private, explaining that they were related to time-sensitive investment opportunities in different time zones. Bills would arrive for credit cards that I didn't remember opening, but when I asked about them, Isadora would explain that they were promotional offers with favorable terms that she'd taken advantage of to improve our credit utilization ratios. Our monthly expenses seemed to be increasing faster than I would have expected, but Isadora assured me that this was normal for people in our income bracket and that she was being careful to track everything for tax purposes. The luxury purchases she made for the house and for herself were always justified by elaborate explanations about investment value or social necessity or long-term planning that sounded reasonable in the moment, but that I never took the time to verify independently. I was making so much money that these concerns seemed trivial, and I was so busy with my trading activities that I was happy to delegate financial management to someone who seemed to understand these matters better than I did. During our second year of marriage, my trading success reached levels that even I found difficult to believe. I was consistently generating monthly returns that exceeded what most professional fund managers achieved in entire years, and my reputation in the trading community was beginning to attract attention from wealthy individuals and institutions who wanted to invest with me. I started a small hedge fund with $10 million of my own money and $50 million from outside investors, and within 6 months I had doubled the fund's value through a series of perfectly timed trades in biotech stocks and cryptocurrency derivatives. The financial media began writing articles about my trading methods, and I was invited to speak at conferences where audiences of professional traders and money managers listened to my theories about market psychology and technical analysis. Isadora was incredibly supportive during this period, attending events with me, hosting dinner parties for potential investors, and managing the administrative details of running a hedge fund while I focused on trading strategies. She seemed to understand the pressures of managing other people's money and would often suggest ways to reduce stress and maintain perspective when the markets were particularly volatile. Her own investment activities appeared to be going well, and she would occasionally mention profits from her portfolio that allowed her to contribute to our household expenses and personal luxuries without relying entirely on my income. This arrangement felt ideal because it meant that both of us were contributing financially to our marriage, even though my contributions were obviously much larger due to the scale of my trading operations. By the end of our second year of marriage, my net worth had reached $12 million, and the hedge fund was managing over $200 million in client assets. I felt like I had achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of professionally and personally, and I was beginning to think about expanding into other areas of finance, perhaps starting an investment bank or acquiring existing financial services companies. Isadora encouraged these ambitions, suggesting that we had reached a level of wealth and influence that would allow us to take bigger risks and pursue more ambitious goals. She would research potential acquisition targets, analyze market opportunities, and present detailed proposals for new business ventures that demonstrated a level of financial sophistication that continued to impress me. When she suggested that we leverage our personal assets to fund these expansion plans, using our penthouse and investment portfolios as collateral for larger credit lines, I agreed because the potential returns seemed to justify the risks and because I trusted her analysis of the financial structures involved. The loans and credit lines that Isadora arranged were complex instruments that I didn't fully understand, but they appeared to be standard tools that wealthy individuals use to optimize their capital allocation and tax efficiency. She explained that by borrowing against our assets rather than liquidating investments, we could maintain our market positions while still having access to cash for new opportunities. The interest rates were reasonable, the terms seemed favorable, and the monthly payments were easily covered by my trading profits, so I signed the documents that she prepared without conducting the kind of detailed analysis that I would have applied to any major trading decision. This was perhaps the biggest mistake I made during our entire relationship, trusting Isadora's financial expertise without verifying the details independently. But at the time, it seemed like a natural division of labor between two people who each had their own areas of professional competence. The third year of our marriage was when everything began to unravel, though it took months for me to recognize the signs of what was really happening. My trading performance remained strong, but I began to notice that our personal expenses were increasing at a rate that seemed inconsistent with our lifestyle, even accounting for the expensive tastes that we had developed over the previous 2 years. Credit card bills were arriving for amounts that seemed too large even for our luxury spending habits, and when I asked Isadora about specific charges, she would provide explanations that were detailed enough to sound plausible, but vague enough that I couldn't easily verify them. She claimed to be researching major purchases like art and jewelry, attending exclusive events that required expensive wardrobe investments, and working with consultants on various business projects that we were supposedly developing together. The monthly payments on our various loans and credit lines were also increasing, which Isadora explained as the result of rising interest rates and changes in the credit markets that were affecting all leveraged investors. These explanations sounded reasonable given my general understanding of how credit markets worked, and I was too busy managing the hedge fund to spend time analyzing our personal finances in detail. I trusted Isadora to handle these matters competently, and I assumed that any problems would be temporary fluctuations that would resolve themselves as the credit market stabilized. It wasn't until I received a call from my accountant asking about several large transactions that I didn't recognize that I began to suspect something was seriously wrong with our financial situation. The call from my accountant, Harrison, came on a Tuesday morning while I was analyzing pre-market futures data and preparing for what looked like a volatile trading session. Harrison had been handling my taxes and basic financial planning for 3 years, and he rarely contacted me directly unless there was something urgent that required my immediate attention. His voice had an edge of concern that I'd never heard before, and he began the conversation by asking if I had time to discuss some irregularities he'd discovered while preparing our quarterly tax estimates. I told him I could spare a few minutes, assuming he was calling about some routine reporting issue or perhaps a discrepancy in the hedge fund's documentation that would require a simple clarification. Instead, Harrison began describing a series of transactions that made no sense to me. Large transfers from our joint accounts to entities I'd never heard of, credit line advances that I didn't remember authorizing, and investment purchases in my name that didn't match any of my trading records. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in and out of accounts that I thought I understood completely. And when I told Harrison that I had no knowledge of these transactions, he suggested that we schedule an emergency meeting to review all of our financial records in detail. I agreed to meet him that afternoon, but first I decided to confront Isadora about the transactions that Harrison had identified, assuming that there must be some reasonable explanation that would clear up the confusion. I found her in our home office, working on her laptop with financial documents spread across the desk, looking like she was engaged in the kind of detailed analysis that I'd grown accustomed to seeing from her over the past 3 years. When I asked her about the transactions that Harrison had mentioned, her reaction was immediate and defensive, claiming that Harrison was incompetent and didn't understand the sophisticated financial structures that she'd been implementing to optimize our tax situation and investment returns. She explained that the transactions were part of a complex arbitrage strategy that involved temporarily moving funds between different accounts to take advantage of timing differences in interest rates and tax treatments. The entities that had received our money were special-purpose vehicles that she'd created with the help of her wealth manager, designed to shield our assets from market volatility and potential legal liabilities that could arise from my hedge fund activities. The credit line advances were tactical moves to maintain liquidity while avoiding the need to sell investments at unfavorable times. And the investment purchases were diversification strategies that would reduce our overall portfolio risk. All of these explanations sounded plausible in isolation, and Isadora delivered them with the kind of confidence and technical sophistication that had always impressed me about her financial knowledge. However, something about her defensive reaction and the complexity of her explanations made me suspicious in a way that I'd never been before about her financial activities. I decided to proceed with my meeting with Harrison and to request copies of all our account statements and transaction records so that I could conduct my own analysis of what had been happening with our money. The meeting with Harrison was a nightmare that lasted 4 hours and revealed the scope of financial manipulation that I would never have believed possible if I hadn't seen the documentation myself. Harrison had prepared a comprehensive analysis of our financial situation, and what he showed me was evidence of systematic fraud that had been occurring for over 18 months. Isadora had been using my reputation and credit history to secure loans and credit lines that I'd never seen, forging my signature on documents and creating a complex web of financial obligations that were all ultimately backed by my assets and income. The special-purpose vehicles she'd mentioned were real entities, but they weren't investment funds designed to optimize our returns. Instead, they were shell companies that existed solely to receive money from our accounts and transfer it to other accounts that Isadora controlled independently. The wealth manager she'd claimed to be working with was actually her lover, a man named Damien Rothschild, who operated a boutique financial services firm that specialized in helping wealthy individuals hide assets from their spouses during divorce proceedings. The arbitrage strategies and diversification investments were fictional, elaborate lies designed to explain why hundreds of thousands of dollars were disappearing from our accounts every month and reappearing in investment portfolios that were legally owned by Isadora alone. Harrison had traced the money flows through multiple layers of legal entities and financial instruments, and the pattern that emerged was unmistakably deliberate and sophisticated. Isadora and Damien had been systematically converting my trading profits into assets that she could claim as her separate property, using my credit and reputation to fund a lifestyle that was far more expensive than even I had realized, and creating financial obligations that would become my responsibility if their scheme was ever discovered. The loans and credit lines that I'd signed were structured in ways that made me personally liable for debts that were actually being used to fund Isadora's independent investment portfolio and her relationship with Damien. The monthly payments that I thought were covering our legitimate household expenses were actually servicing debt that had been used to purchase assets that I would never own. The luxury purchases that Isadora had claimed were investments in our shared lifestyle were actually investments in properties and accounts that were titled in her name alone or in the names of entities that she controlled without my involvement. Harrison estimated that over the previous 18 months, approximately $2.4 million of my money had been transferred to accounts and investments that I had no legal claim to, and the outstanding debt obligations that had been created in my name totaled another $1.8 million. The total financial impact of Isadora's scheme was over $4 million, money that had been stolen from me through legal instruments that I had unknowingly signed and financial structures that I had been manipulated into approving. The most devastating aspect of what Harrison revealed was that the scheme was designed to be self-perpetuating and virtually undetectable until it reached a scale that would be impossible to hide. Every month, Isadora was using new credit advances to make the minimum payments on existing debt obligations, creating the appearance that our finances were stable while actually increasing our total liabilities. The investment returns that she claimed to be generating were actually just recycled portions of money that she'd stolen from me, presented as profits to justify continued access to our accounts and continued authority over our financial decisions. The business ventures and expansion plans that she'd been proposing were designed to create additional opportunities for asset conversion and debt creation, not to generate legitimate profits. Damien's role in the scheme was to provide professional credibility and technical expertise, using his credentials as a licensed financial advisor to create legal structures that would withstand casual scrutiny while serving the ultimate purpose of transferring wealth from my name to Isadora's name. Harrison explained that this type of financial fraud was more common than most people realized, particularly among wealthy couples where one spouse had significantly more income than the other and where the higher-earning spouse was too busy or too trusting to monitor financial activities closely. The legal remedies available to me were limited because many of the transactions had been structured to appear consensual and because proving fraud would require demonstrating that Isadora had intentionally deceived me, rather than simply making poor financial decisions. The criminal implications were unclear because the line between aggressive financial planning and outright fraud was often difficult to establish in cases involving sophisticated financial instruments and family relationships. Harrison recommended that I immediately freeze all credit lines and accounts that Isadora had access to, hire a forensic accountant to trace the full extent of the asset transfers, and retain a divorce attorney who specialized in high net worth cases involving financial fraud. He also suggested that I consider whether there were any criminal violations that should be reported to law enforcement, though he warned that pursuing criminal charges could complicate the civil proceedings and might not result in recovery of the stolen assets. The drive home from Harrison's office was the longest 30 minutes of my life, and I spent the entire time trying to process the reality that my marriage had been a carefully orchestrated financial crime that had been happening right under my nose for over a year. Everything I thought I knew about Isadora, everything I believed about our relationship, everything I had trusted about our shared goals and values had been a fiction designed to facilitate the systematic theft of my wealth. The woman I loved more than anything in the world had been playing a completely different game than I was, using my own success and generosity against me in ways that were breathtakingly cynical and calculating. When I walked into our penthouse that evening, Isadora was in the kitchen preparing dinner, wearing one of the expensive dresses that I now realized had been purchased with stolen money, looking like the perfect wife that she had been pretending to be for the past 3 years. She greeted me with the same warm smile and affectionate kiss that had been part of our daily routine, and for a moment I felt like I was losing my mind, wondering how someone could maintain such a convincing performance while systematically destroying the person they were supposed to love. I didn't immediately confront her about what Harrison had discovered because I needed time to think about my strategy and because I wanted to gather additional evidence before revealing that I knew about her activities. Instead, I told her that I'd had a productive day of trading and that I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, maintaining the same facade of normalcy that she had been maintaining for months while planning her betrayal. Over the next 3 days, I conducted my own investigation into our financial records, reviewing every document I could access and trying to understand the full scope of what Isadora and Damien had done to me. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it was also incomplete because many of the most damaging documents were stored in accounts and systems that I didn't have access to. I hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance on Isadora's activities and to gather information about her relationship with Damien, and what he discovered confirmed my worst suspicions about the personal dimension of their collaboration. They had been conducting an affair for over 2 years, meeting regularly at expensive hotels and restaurants that were being paid for with my stolen money, traveling together on trips that Isadora had claimed were business-related, and planning a future together that involved my complete financial destruction and her liberation from our marriage with millions of dollars in assets that she had systematically stolen from me. The private investigator provided photographs, credit card records, hotel receipts, and phone records that documented a relationship that was both romantic and criminal, a partnership that combined emotional intimacy with financial fraud in ways that revealed a level of betrayal that I would never have imagined possible. Damien was not just helping Isadora steal my money, he was her lover, her co-conspirator, and her planned future husband once she had successfully extracted everything she could from our marriage. The trips they had taken together, the expensive gifts they had exchanged, the romantic dinners and luxury hotel stays had all been funded by money that Damien had helped her steal from me, using sophisticated financial instruments that I had unknowingly authorized. Their text messages, which the private investigator had obtained through methods that I didn't ask about, revealed discussions about their future life together, plans for how to maximize the assets they could steal from me, and strategies for timing Isadora's departure from our marriage to minimize the risk of criminal prosecution or asset recovery. They discussed me with casual contempt, referring to me as naive and gullible, mocking my trust in Isadora and my failure to detect their activities despite clear warning signs that they believed should have been obvious to anyone with basic financial knowledge. Damien had apparently boasted about how easy it was to manipulate wealthy men who were too busy making money to pay attention to how it was being spent, and Isadora had expressed amazement at how long they had been able to continue their scheme without detection. Their communications revealed that they had been planning to continue the fraud for at least another year, potentially stealing millions more before finally triggering a divorce that would leave me with massive debt obligations and no legal recourse to recover the stolen assets. The emotional impact of reading these messages was even more devastating than the financial implications, because they revealed that everything I had believed about Isadora's love for me had been an elaborate performance designed to facilitate theft. She had never loved me, had never been happy in our marriage, had never shared my dreams for our future together. Instead, she had seen me as a mark, a target to be exploited, a source of wealth that could be systematically drained through careful manipulation and legal trickery. The life we had built together, the experiences we had shared, the intimacy and partnership that I had treasured had all been fake, just another component of a long-term financial crime that had been disguised as a marriage. Armed with overwhelming evidence of Isadora's betrayal and theft, I knew that confronting her directly would be pointless and potentially dangerous to my legal position. So instead, I began working with a team of attorneys and forensic accountants to develop a comprehensive strategy for recovering my stolen assets and protecting what remained of my financial position. The legal team that I assembled specialized in complex financial fraud cases, and they immediately began the process of freezing accounts, securing assets, and building a case that would stand up in both civil and criminal proceedings. The forensic accountants were able to trace the money flows through multiple layers of shell companies and offshore accounts, revealing that the scope of the theft was actually larger than Harrison had initially estimated, totaling over $6 million when all the hidden transactions and leveraged positions were properly accounted for. The sophistication of the scheme was extraordinary, involving dozens of legal entities, multiple offshore jurisdictions, and financial instruments that had been specifically designed to obscure the ultimate ownership and control of the stolen assets. Damien had used his professional credentials and industry connections to create a network of collaborating professionals, including attorneys, accountants, and banking officials who had either been deceived about the true nature of the transactions or had been compensated for their willingness to facilitate financial fraud. The legal team discovered that Isadora and Damien had been planning to trigger the final phase of their scheme within the next 6 months, using a fabricated marital crisis as justification for a divorce that would allow Isadora to claim millions of dollars in assets as her equitable share of our marital property. They had already retained divorce attorneys, prepared false financial statements that minimized my net worth while maximizing the apparent value of Isadora's separate property, and created a narrative about my alleged financial irresponsibility and emotional abuse that would justify an extreme division of assets in Isadora's favor. The divorce filing would have been accompanied by allegations of domestic violence and financial misconduct that would have destroyed my reputation in the financial community and potentially resulted in criminal charges that would have made it impossible for me to continue operating my hedge fund. The timing of their plan was strategically chosen to coincide with a period when my hedge fund was facing regulatory scrutiny related to some aggressive trading positions, which would have made it appear that Isadora was leaving me because of professional misconduct rather than because she had been systematically stealing from me for years. My legal team advised that the best strategy would be to file for divorce first before Isadora and Damien could implement their planned exit strategy and to simultaneously initiate criminal and civil proceedings that would freeze their assets and prevent them from fleeing the jurisdiction with my stolen money. This approach would also allow me to control the narrative about our marriage's dissolution and to present evidence of the financial fraud before Isadora could present her fabricated claims about my alleged misconduct. The attorneys warned that the proceedings would be lengthy and expensive, potentially costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, but they were confident that the evidence against Isadora and Damien was strong enough to result in both asset recovery and criminal convictions. The timing of these legal actions required careful coordination because once Isadora realized that I had discovered her scheme, she would likely attempt to accelerate the transfer of remaining assets and potentially flee to a jurisdiction where asset recovery would be more difficult. The attorneys obtained temporary restraining orders that would freeze all accounts and prevent asset transfers. But these orders would only be effective once they were served on Isadora and Damien, which meant that I needed to maintain the pretense of normalcy until the legal machinery was fully in place. For 2 weeks, I continued living with Isadora while secretly preparing to destroy her life in the same systematic way that she had been destroying mine. And the psychological strain of maintaining this deception while knowing the truth about her betrayal was almost unbearable. Every interaction felt like theater. Every conversation was a performance. Every expression of affection was a lie that I had to reciprocate in order to protect my legal strategy. I watched her continuing to access our accounts, continuing to meet with Damien, continuing to plan their future together with my stolen money, all while pretending to be the loving wife that she had never actually been. The most difficult part was resisting the urge to confront her about what I had discovered, to demand explanations, to express my rage and hurt and bewilderment at the depth of her betrayal. Instead, I had to channel all of those emotions into the legal and financial planning that would ultimately be my only path to justice and recovery. On a Monday morning in late September, while Isadora was at what she claimed was a yoga class, but what I knew was actually a meeting with Damien to finalize their plans for my destruction, a team of process servers and law enforcement officers simultaneously served restraining orders and search warrants on both of them, freezing their assets and securing evidence that would support the criminal prosecutions that were already being prepared. I was at my office when the legal actions were initiated, and I spent the morning fielding calls from attorneys, accountants, and law enforcement officials who were coordinating the complex process of unwinding the financial fraud and securing the evidence needed for prosecution. By noon, Isadora's access to all of our joint accounts had been terminated, her personal accounts had been frozen pending investigation, and Damien's business had been shut down by financial regulators who had been alerted to his role in facilitating the theft of client assets. The speed and scope of the legal actions caught them completely off guard, and neither of them had time to implement their planned exit strategy or transfer additional assets beyond the reach of law enforcement. When I returned home that evening, I found Isadora waiting for me in our living room, looking like a completely different person than the woman I had been living with for the past 3 years. The mask of loving wife had been completely discarded, replaced by an expression of cold fury and desperate calculation that revealed the predator she had always been beneath the carefully constructed facade. She immediately began making threats about the divorce proceedings, claiming that she had evidence of my own financial misconduct that she would present to prosecutors if I didn't agree to drop the criminal charges and settle the civil litigation on terms favorable to her. She threatened to destroy my reputation in the financial community, to make allegations about my hedge fund operations that would result in regulatory sanctions and client withdrawals, and to claim that I had been physically and emotionally abusive during our marriage. None of these threats had any basis in reality, but they revealed the depth of planning that had gone into her scheme and the ruthless mindset that had driven her to betray someone who had loved and trusted her completely. I responded to her threats with calm professionalism, explaining that my attorneys had anticipated exactly this type of response and had already prepared countermeasures that would neutralize any false allegations she might attempt to make. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable, the paper trail was clear and comprehensive, and the criminal case was strong enough that prosecutors were confident of obtaining convictions even if she refused to cooperate. Her best option was to work with my attorneys to negotiate a settlement that would maximize asset recovery while minimizing her potential criminal exposure. But that opportunity would disappear quickly if she continued to make threats or attempted to obstruct the legal proceedings. Isadora's reaction to this information was to alternate between rage and desperation, threatening one moment and pleading the next, claiming that she had only been trying to protect us from my alleged recklessness while simultaneously admitting that she had been planning to leave me for Damien. The contradictions in her statements were evidence of the psychological pressure she was under, but they were also revealing about the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized our entire relationship. Even when caught with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she was incapable of taking responsibility or expressing genuine remorse, instead continuing to manipulate and deceive in ways that confirmed that everything about our marriage had been a performance designed to facilitate theft. That night was the last time we would ever live in the same house, and I spent it in the guest bedroom while Isadora made phone calls to attorneys and accomplices, trying to develop some strategy for minimizing the consequences of her exposure. I could hear her crying and arguing and pleading through the walls, and part of me felt sympathy for the desperation she was experiencing, but that sympathy was overwhelmed by anger at the years of deception and by determination to recover everything she had stolen from me. The next morning, Isadora moved out of our penthouse, taking only personal belongings that were clearly hers and leaving behind all the luxury items that had been purchased with stolen money. She went to stay with her sister in California while her attorneys worked to negotiate a plea agreement that would allow her to avoid prison time in exchange for cooperation in recovering the stolen assets. The house felt completely different without her presence, like a stage set that had been struck after the end of a long-running play, and I began the psychological process of separating the memories of our life together from the reality of what our relationship had actually been. The criminal proceedings moved quickly once both Isadora and Damien were arrested and formally charged with multiple felonies related to financial fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence against them was so comprehensive that their attorneys immediately began negotiating plea agreements rather than attempting to contest the charges, and within 6 months, both of them had pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation in asset recovery and restitution payments. Isadora received a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, while Damien received 30 months because of his professional status and his role as the architect of the scheme. Both of them were ordered to pay full restitution, which totaled over $8 million when interest, penalties, and legal costs were included, and both of them were permanently barred from working in the financial services industry. The civil litigation was more complex and time-consuming, involving multiple jurisdictions and requiring the cooperation of foreign governments to recover assets that had been hidden in offshore accounts. My legal team was eventually able to trace and recover approximately 70% of the stolen money, though the process took over 2 years and cost nearly $1 million in legal and accounting fees. Some assets were never recovered because they had been spent on lifestyle expenses or had been hidden in jurisdictions that refused to cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. But the recovery was sufficient to restore most of my financial position and to pay the debts that had been created through Isadora's scheme. The hedge fund survived the scandal, though I lost several major clients who were uncomfortable with the publicity surrounding the criminal case, and it took nearly 2 years to rebuild the business to its previous level of assets under management. The experience of being systematically betrayed and robbed by the person I trusted most fundamentally changed my approach to both personal relationships and professional activities, making me more cautious about trusting others and more diligent about monitoring financial activities that I had previously delegated to others. The psychological impact of discovering that my marriage had been an elaborate criminal scheme was more difficult to recover from than the financial losses, and it took extensive therapy and time to develop the ability to trust anyone again with either my money or my emotions. The aftermath of Isadora's betrayal and the legal proceedings that followed became a period of profound reconstruction, not just financially but psychologically and emotionally, as I struggled to rebuild a life that had been fundamentally based on lies and deception for years. The first year after her arrest was the most difficult, as I dealt with the public embarrassment of having been so thoroughly deceived, the complicated process of unwinding the financial fraud, and the deeper challenge of understanding how someone I had loved completely could have been systematically destroying me while maintaining such a convincing performance of devotion and partnership. The media attention surrounding the case was intense, but ultimately helpful to my reputation, as the details that emerged painted me as a victim of sophisticated financial fraud rather than as someone who had been complicit in questionable activities. Several major financial publications wrote detailed articles about the case, describing it as an example of how even experienced investors and financial professionals could be vulnerable to manipulation by trusted family members who had access to their accounts and decision-making processes. The coverage actually enhanced my credibility in the trading community, as other professionals recognized that the sophistication of the scheme reflected poorly on Isadora and Damien rather than on my judgment or competence. My hedge fund not only recovered from the initial client withdrawals, but actually grew significantly as investors appreciated my transparency about what had happened and my commitment to implementing enhanced oversight procedures that would prevent similar fraud in the future. The institutional investors who had initially been concerned about the scandal ultimately viewed my handling of the crisis as evidence of strong risk management and ethical leadership, qualities that were increasingly valued in an industry that had been plagued by high-profile cases of financial misconduct. Within 18 months of Isadora's conviction, my assets under management had grown to over $400 million, nearly double what they had been before the scandal, and my personal net worth had recovered to levels that exceeded my pre-fraud position. The business success provided financial security and professional validation, but the emotional recovery was a much more complex and lengthy process that required confronting fundamental questions about trust, judgment, and the nature of intimate relationships. The therapy process forced me to examine not just what had happened during my marriage to Isadora, but also the patterns of thinking and behavior that had made me vulnerable to her manipulation in the first place. I had to acknowledge that my focus on financial success had created blind spots in other areas of my life, that my willingness to delegate important decisions to others had been motivated more by convenience than by trust, and that my confidence in my ability to read people and situations had been based on limited experience with truly sophisticated deception. The therapist helped me understand that highly successful people in competitive fields often develop psychological patterns that make them particularly vulnerable to certain types of manipulation, because their success creates both resources that others want to exploit and personality traits that skilled manipulators know how to target. My drive to achieve and provide had made me eager to share my success with someone I loved. My analytical nature had made me susceptible to complex explanations that sounded sophisticated, and my busy professional schedule had made me grateful to have someone handle details that I didn't have time for. These weren't character flaws, but they were vulnerabilities that someone like Isadora could identify and exploit systematically over time. Understanding these patterns was essential for developing healthier approaches to future relationships, but the process of developing that understanding was painful and required accepting responsibility for my own contributions to what had happened without excusing or minimizing Isadora's criminal behavior. The legal proceedings provided a form of justice and financial recovery, but they couldn't repair the psychological damage of learning that someone you love and trust has been systematically deceiving and robbing you while planning your destruction. The most difficult aspect of recovery was learning to trust my own judgment again, particularly in personal relationships where the stakes were emotional rather than financial, and where the warning signs of deception might be more subtle than they had been in the business context where I had always been successful. Dating again seemed impossible for the first year after the divorce, not just because of the practical complications of the legal proceedings, but because the idea of allowing someone access to my personal life and financial information felt terrifyingly risky after what I had experienced with Isadora. The few attempts I made to connect with other people romantically ended quickly because I found myself constantly looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, unable to enjoy the natural development of intimacy because I was so focused on protecting myself from potential betrayal. It took nearly 2 years and extensive therapy before I felt capable of developing genuine emotional connections with other people, and even then the process was gradual and carefully managed, rather than the spontaneous and passionate experience that had characterized my relationship with Isadora. The woman I eventually became involved with, a literature professor named Evangeline who had no connection to the financial world and no interest in luxury lifestyle, was initially frustrated by my cautious approach to our relationship and my insistence on maintaining separate financial accounts and decision-making processes. However, as she learned more about what I had experienced with Isadora, she came to understand that my caution was not a reflection of lack of trust in her personally, but rather a necessary boundary that allowed me to feel secure enough to develop emotional intimacy without constantly worrying about potential exploitation. Our relationship developed slowly over the course of a year, based on shared interests, intellectual compatibility, and gradually building trust rather than on the intense passion and lifestyle compatibility that had characterized my marriage to Isadora. Evangeline's approach to money and material possessions was completely different from Isadora's, focused on experiences and relationships rather than acquisition and display, and her financial independence meant that she had no reason to be interested in my wealth except to the extent that it allowed us to do things together that we both enjoyed. The contrast between the two relationships was instructive about the difference between genuine partnership and sophisticated manipulation, and spending time with someone who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with my financial success helped restore my confidence and my ability to form authentic connections with other people. The professional lessons from the Isadora experience were equally important and had lasting effects on how I managed both my hedge fund and my personal finances. I implemented comprehensive oversight procedures that required multiple approvals for any significant financial decisions, hired independent auditors to review all transactions on a quarterly basis, and established separate legal and accounting relationships that prevented any single person from gaining complete control over my financial affairs. These measures were expensive and sometimes inconvenient, but they provided peace of mind that was worth far more than their cost. And they actually improved the hedge fund's operations by creating additional layers of verification and analysis that caught errors and identified opportunities that might have been missed under less rigorous procedures. The enhanced oversight also attracted additional institutional investors who valued the transparency and risk management that the procedures represented. And the fund's performance improved as the more systematic approach to decision-making eliminated some of the emotional and intuitive elements that had occasionally led to poor investment choices. I also diversified my personal wealth more broadly, investing in real estate, private equity, and other assets that would be difficult for any individual to manipulate or steal. And I maintained liquid reserves that would allow me to survive financially even if my primary income sources were compromised. The goal was not to become paranoid or to assume that everyone was potentially dishonest, but rather to structure my affairs in ways that would limit the damage that could be caused by any future betrayal while still allowing me to take appropriate risks and pursue profitable opportunities. The broader perspective that emerged from the Isadora experience was that success in any field requires not just technical competence and hard work, but also the wisdom to recognize that success creates vulnerabilities that need to be actively managed through appropriate systems and boundaries. Wealthy people, successful professionals, and others who have built valuable assets or reputations are inevitably targets for various forms of exploitation, and protecting those assets requires the same level of attention and planning that went into creating them in the first place. The mistake I had made was assuming that personal relationships were exempt from the careful analysis and risk management that I applied to business relationships, when in fact personal relationships often involve even greater potential for both benefit and harm because they involve emotional as well as financial stakes. The recovery process also involved rebuilding relationships with friends and family members who had been affected by the scandal and who had sometimes found it difficult to understand how someone as sophisticated as I was could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone they had all liked and trusted. Some relationships were damaged permanently because people concluded that I must have been willfully blind to obvious warning signs or that my focus on wealth had somehow contributed to the betrayal I had experienced. The recovery process also involved rebuilding relationships with friends and family members who had been affected by the scandal and who had sometimes found it difficult to understand how someone as sophisticated as I was could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone they had all liked and trusted. Some relationships were damaged permanently because people concluded that I must have been willfully blind to obvious warning signs or that my focus on wealth had somehow contributed to the betrayal I had experienced. The recovery process also involved rebuilding relationships with friends and family members who had been affected by the scandal and who had sometimes found it difficult to understand how someone as sophisticated as I was could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone they had all liked and trusted. Some relationships were damaged permanently because people concluded that I must have been willfully blind to obvious warning signs or that my focus on wealth had somehow contributed to the betrayal I had experienced. However, most of the people who mattered to me ultimately came to understand that sophisticated fraud is designed to be undetectable and that victims of financial manipulation should not be blamed for the criminal behavior of the perpetrators. The support of friends and family was crucial during the most difficult periods of the legal proceedings and recovery process, and their acceptance helped me maintain perspective about the fact that one person's betrayal did not reflect on my fundamental worth or judgment. 3 years after Isadora's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from her while she was serving her prison sentence, attempting to explain her behavior and to express remorse for what she had done to me and to our marriage. The letter was clearly written with the help of psychological counselors and was probably motivated more by her desire to improve her chances for early parole than by genuine remorse, but it provided some insight into her mindset during the years when she had been systematically betraying me. She claimed that she had initially loved me genuinely, but had gradually become resentful of what she perceived as my emotional unavailability and my focus on work rather than on our relationship. The affair with Damien had begun as an emotional escape from what she experienced as loneliness in our marriage, and the financial fraud had developed gradually as a way to assert some control over her life and to prepare for what she had come to see as the inevitable end of our marriage. She claimed that she had never intended for the scheme to reach the scale that it ultimately achieved, but that each step had seemed logical at the time as a response to circumstances that felt beyond her control. The explanation was self-serving and failed to acknowledge the calculated and systematic nature of what she had done, but it was consistent with what I had learned in therapy about how people rationalize behavior that they know is wrong, but that serves their immediate emotional or practical needs. Reading the letter was painful, but also helpful in providing closure about questions that had haunted me since discovering her betrayal, and I was able to respond with forgiveness for my own psychological benefit while still maintaining appropriate boundaries about any future contact or relationship. Isadora was released from prison after serving 14 months of her sentence, and she moved to a different state to start over with a new identity and career, but she was required to continue making restitution payments for the remaining balance of what she had stolen, payments that would continue for at least 10 years and that served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of her choices. Damien served his full sentence and also relocated after his release, but his career in finance was permanently destroyed, and he was forced to work in unrelated fields to support himself and his restitution obligations. The personal and professional reconstruction that followed the Isadora betrayal ultimately led to a life that was more authentic and sustainable than what I had experienced during my marriage, even though the process of getting there was extremely difficult and expensive in both financial and emotional terms. My relationship with Evangeline developed into a marriage that was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine partnership, rather than on lifestyle compatibility and physical attraction. And the financial security that I had rebuilt allowed us to focus on experiences and contributions that were more meaningful than the luxury consumption that had characterized my previous relationship. The hedge fund continued to grow and prosper, but I maintained better balance between professional success and personal relationships, and I used my wealth in ways that reflected my values rather than simply accumulating assets for their own sake or to support an expensive lifestyle. The experience taught me that true security comes not from having enough money to buy whatever you want, but from having relationships and systems that you can trust, from understanding your own vulnerabilities and limitations, and from building a life that is based on authentic values rather than external validation or competitive achievement. The most important lesson was that success without wisdom is ultimately dangerous because it creates resources and opportunities that can be exploited by others, and because it can lead to overconfidence that makes you vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. The combination of financial success and emotional maturity that I eventually achieved was more valuable than either element would have been alone, and the painful experience of betrayal and recovery was ultimately worth the lessons it taught about what really matters in life and how to protect and nurture the things that are truly valuable. Thanks for being here on Reddit Whispers. I've shared my story, but now I want to hear yours. What's the most surprising decision that turned everything around for you? Your comment could be the lifeline someone else is looking for today.